the epistles. Oh, everybody loves the Paul. We love Paul. Okay, great. And there actually has been a tendency within the Christian tradition of a Pauline priority when it comes to understanding Christian theology, understanding those, Paul. I get it. There's a lot of meat to Paul and his writings, but you know, so the epistles, and particularly the Pauline epistles, they hold a very, very special place in our heart. But we have to understand some things about the epistles. We can't just boldly proclaim how great they are without digging a little bit deeper. And so in the next couple minutes, what I want to do is give you some ideas on how to dig deep, because baby, these things are deep. All right, and you could just get lost in these things. Yeah, these letters are 3 chapters long, but man, you can spend a lifetime dealing with these things because they're just that complex, that deep. And not only for Paul, really. I mean, you're talking about James, you're talking about Peter, and you're talking about the letter to the Hebrews and those types of things. So these babies, they're the meat. They're really the foundation for our theological discourse. They're the meat of really what it means to kind of understand Jesus. Because that's exactly what these people are doing. They're writing letters in order to kind of tease out the implications of this Jesus dude and what it means to be followers of Him. So we're really getting at the fundamental essence of theological discourse. So as I said, great stuff. Don't get me wrong. But very, very deep and very, very complex. What we have to understand, think letters. Think letters. Epistles are letters. They're an ancient correspondence. They're from one person writing to one person or more people. Fundamentally, that's what they are. It's often associated with Paul. Rightly so. That's the majority of the epistles, majority of the New Testament. But there are other dudes involved as well. Let's not forget James. Let's not forget Peter. 1st and 2nd and 3rd John. Let's not forget those dudes. And then you have the Hebrews, letter of the Hebrews, and those types of things. What we have to understand the importance of letters in antiquity. I mean, that's how people communicated over distance. And so it wasn't, pull out my cell phone here, or text message, beep, boop, boop, email. No, it was snail mail, okay? So just as we make fun of the post office, where'd you send it? You send it to me email? No, I sent it to you snail mail. All right, no, this is how they communicated. This is how Paul communicated with all those churches he set up that we read about in the book of Acts, okay? So they're very, very vital and very, very important for Paul, for the fathers of these congregations, in order to kind of continue to show them the influence that they need, and kind of give them the influence and give them the advice and give them the directions they needed from time to time. What they do is they contain passionate and complex arguments. As I just mentioned, these babies are deep. And some of Paul's letters, Paul was a rhetorician. We'll get into that in a little bit here. But they're deep and they're thick. And you got to read and reread and reread. I mean, if there's one portion of Scripture that you just read and reread and reread and reread and still don't really know what it means, it's the epistles, particularly Paul's epistles. Some of those babies are just nasty. Okay, but they were written to specific audiences in a specific time. Okay, Fee and Stewart call this occasional documents. Kind of sounds like the prophetic corpus, doesn't it? Just as the prophetic corpus, the original oracles were given in light of a specific historical situation at a specific time to specific people. Ding, ding, ding. Drop my pen. Ding, ding, ding. The epistles did the same thing as well. Okay, they were written to discuss certain historical events, and they were. That's why when you read through the Pauline epistles and to James, the first thing you say, James, who's it to? It's written to a specific person, and then very quickly you figure out what in the heck is going on, because those issues that are of importance, those issues that resulted in this letter in the first place, they come to the surface very, very quickly. Okay. It requires, so all that to say, because there are documents, occasional documents like the prophetic, just like the prophetic corpus, it requires a knowledge of history. Here's another thing that's a little different. It takes inference. One side of the phone conversation, folks. Just as the other day when I sit there and my wife's talking on the phone on the couch right next to me, and I'm just hearing her. I'm trying to figure out, okay, who's she talking to? Okay, what's the issue? What are they talking about? Should I even care about this? I only get one half of the conversation, right? Same basic principle. All we have is the letters. And we have to use inference to kind of figure out. This is very, very important because we need to try to figure out what's going on in 1st and 2nd Timothy, or in Timothy when it tells the women they need to be quiet in church. What's going on in Corinthians when we have Paul, we sit there and read Paul talking about how women need to just kind of shh. What's going on? Kind of weird. That's only one half the conversation, folks. And we got to figure out what's going on as best as we possibly can in order to figure out why is Paul saying those types of things. Because I guarantee you, we know that he was addressing a certain situation. Does that situation translate? That's the question. As such, the letters, generally speaking, they will follow a general form. Okay. Again, this gets at the literary conventions of the day. They wrote letters just like greetings, hello, dear John, so-and-so. And we get in the body of the letter, we always sign it, say, sincerely, Joe Dokes. Those types of things. Same basic principle applies. There were general forms to ancient letters. Largely, they can be defined by a declaration of the writer. I, Paul, servant of Christ Jesus, Romans 1:1. Recipients, am writing to, declaration of the recipients, and then there's usually a greeting. Okay? Hello, what's up? Excuse me. And these are very formal. Just superficial stuff. Yay, ha! So happy to hear you again. Yeah. Great. And then there's the prayer and thanksgiving. Okay, thank you. And that's kind of really closely associated with the greeting. They kind of flow into each other very, very easy. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish, except if you're reading the book of Galatians, when Paul just immediately starts screaming at them. Very significant. Okay? That portion of the general form is not there. What's going on here? So knowing this general form will give us insight into what really Paul's trying to say or the writer's trying to say. Galatians is a good example. And that whole flowery language just does not exist. Paul is extremely ticked off by what's happening to the Galatian people, by the direction they're going, and he just comes in guns blazing, okay? I mean, just gives them both barrels of the shotgun right away. I mean, he's not messing around, folks. So it's very, very important to understand kind of the general form, because when it deviates from that, it gives us a little bit of insight. Okay, then we have the body, and this is where the meat of the argument goes and those types of things. And then we have the final farewell greeting, which is kind of just kind of revisiting the whole flowery language. Yay, I hope to see you soon. Paul talks about this a lot. I hope to see you soon. I want to make a visit, yada, yada, yada. Okay, general form, general rules. No epistle really follows it perfectly, but general ideas based on what we know about how ancient letters were written. Speaking of general forms, the epistles largely employed different types of Greco-Roman rhetoric. Okay? Rhetoric. The art of presentation, the art of speaking, that type of thing. Okay? The epistles were just as Israel produced their literature in an ancient Near Eastern context, the New Testament writers produced their literature in a Greco-Roman context. Okay? Context, culture, affecting the way we write, affecting communication, those types of things. What we have to understand is there are three different types of rhetoric, usually involved with the epistles. There's forensic rhetoric. This is judicial rhetoric. This is telling us, this is defending oneself or accusing another person in light of a past course of action. Paul does this from time to time, okay? You kind of remember what he did before he became a Christian? Yeah, he beat the living tar out of Christians and put them in jail and killed some of them, okay? Paul is constantly defending himself. From time to time, he will employ forensic rhetoric because he's always fighting against a bunch of people who still don't quite trust him. I mean, think about this. Remember Ananias in Acts? Really? Jesus? You want me to go see him? I've heard about him. You sure? You're telling me he's a Christian? So this is the dynamic that Paul constantly deals with throughout his ministry. So from time to time, elements of Galatians, because when we read and we kind of figure out what's going on behind the scenes in Galatians, Paul is being accused. And people are saying, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And so Paul is defending himself. So we see that in certain places where Paul has to really kind of go on the offensive. And at times he accuses things. He accuses, it's the same book in Galatians, he actually accuses Peter of missing the boat. when he goes and has his social gatherings with the Judaizers and those types of things. So it's there. Deliberative rhetoric. This is persuasion. Okay, deliberative rhetoric is the writer is trying to persuade the audience into a certain course of action. The book of Galatians largely is this. Corinthians is a lot of this. Philemon. Get rid of your slave, dude. You don't need him anymore. Okay, that's deliberative rhetoric. That's persuasion. And Paul is building an argument toward the release of this man, of this slave. And so there are a lot of that going on with Philemon. So that's an important. Epideictic, and that just speaks to communal values in order to influence a current state or status quo. Okay, so this is not as aggressive as either forensic rhetoric or deliberative rhetoric, but rather they're speaking to a common set of norms, of principles in order to make sure that they kind of stay on the right track. First Thessalonians largely can be kind of interpreted as this. So again, these types of rhetoric are employed throughout the epistles, and when we understand what's going on here, we begin to get at the essence of the writer's argument. So if we know that he's on the offensive and he's trying to defend himself, well, we know how to really kind of take this language. When Peter's really calling the audience at Galatia, or when Paul is really kind of calling the audience at Galatia out, it's not because he hates them. It's because he's passionate and he wants them to understand that the road that they're getting ready to go on is the complete and wrong direction. All right, so we have to kind of learn how to take those really, really passionate and emotive words and kind of know what to do with them. So the epistles, again, just to reiterate, they may not necessarily have one type of rhetoric. They may be a cross-pollination. Just know that. I mean, it's very, very difficult to say, even Galatians, there's a big debate about Galatians. Is Galatians merely deliberative rhetoric, or is it also forensic rhetoric? Because, like I mentioned earlier, you can make the argument there's both stuff in there. So I think the best way to go is to not necessarily just say it's this, but rather it's predominantly this and there are other elements, or there's just a cross-pollination of elements and those types of things. And again, understanding the rhetoric helps us to understand the logic of the complexity of thought. Because as I mentioned, these things are really, really deep and really, really complex and really, really thick. So it's really, really important to kind of be aware of those types of things. So general principles for interpreting the epistles. Just as I mentioned that you really should grasp the entire work of the Gospels as a whole, you really also need to do the same thing with the epistles, because you really need to know where the argument's going. Okay? The good part about it is you're not dealing with 28 chapters like you're doing with the Gospels. You're dealing with 5, 6 chapters. Yeah, they're incredibly thick and incredibly complicated at times. We do have the Romans, we do have Corinthians, which are rather lengthy, but generally speaking, you're dealing with more manageable length of text here. So it goes a lot quickly. But still, the principle is that you want to keep an eye on the forest as a whole. You don't want to get consumed with individual trees, but rather you want to be able to take a step back, because when you do want to focus on a particular part, you need to understand where it sits in the whole. Okay, as a whole. So where is this? I want to focus in on Paul's statements here, but the first thing I need to understand is, where does this fit in the totality of his argument? So the first thing that we need to do is actually get a grasp of the whole, just like the Gospels. Okay, so it's very, very important. Again, just like the Gospels, but probably a little bit more importantly than the Gospels, and on the same plane as what we do with the prophetic literature, we need to really try to understand the historical situation that's being addressed. Because I mentioned, there's something going on there, okay? There's something going on there. Paul has always been the one to kind of defy what you think you know about the kingdom of God. You think that the Gentiles... No, it's about the inclusion of the Gentiles. You think you know where the Gentiles sit in it, but you're wrong. Paul's always been that type of person that kind of cuts against the grain. So for him to sit there and say, oh yeah, those women, they just need to be quiet. That doesn't sit right with me. So there's something else going on. And when we kind of, do a little bit more research and kind of, connect the dots, fill in the gaps, make some logical inferences, we realize that Paul's addressing a specific situation. So when he tells Timothy, hey, you tell those women they need to be quiet. Okay? He's telling those women in that situation, because they're causing stinking problems. And he knows that in order to get past this, that's got to be nipped in the bud. Okay? So we have to understand what are universal proclamations and rather culturally determined proclamations. So it's very, very important. Again, consider what the text cannot mean. Fee and Stewart, they really hammer this point home. If there is no way that Paul ever could have meant that, then why are we trying to bring it into our frame of reference? Again, we're getting at this idea of intent, of authorial intent, that we can't just say, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what the author said. It's what I think. That's ridiculous because Paul's writing to communicate something. And if we don't want to consider what Paul's trying to communicate, who are we? What are we doing? I mean, this is the dude that articulated the essence of what we believe in. This is one of the first profound exegetors, interpreters of who Jesus was. And if we're not going to consider who are we? What are we doing? I mean, seriously. Okay? So if there's no way Paul could have meant that, and there are times where we can figure out, no, Paul did not mean this. James did not mean this. Okay? Hebrews is not talking about that. Then it's gone. It's off the table. We shouldn't be dealing with it. Okay, so we have to figure that. And then ponder the exhortations in light of what I call the socio-historical chasm. Okay, let's be honest here, folks. Okay? There's a whole lot of history and a whole lot of cultural change that separates us as 21st century American Christians and the original audience of Corinth during the first century CE. Different values, just a bunch of different stuff. Okay? And we could go on and on and on, and that's a discussion for another time. What that means is that certain statements need to be weighed, and certain ideas and certain exhortations need to be weighed. Just as we consider the chasm of the Israelite law in light of Jesus and just in light of history and culture, we also need to understand what's going on here. So if there are specific points of continuity, Paul is addressing a specific situation that, by golly, we still struggle with today. All right? Yeah, that makes application, that makes interpretation very, very easy. It's with those points it's with those issues that don't really have a great correspondence, a really nice, neat correspondence. That's where we struggle with. Okay? So when Paul talks about, homosexuality being a perversion of what was intended in Romans chapter 1. It's fairly definitive, folks. All right? It's not this, it's what type of homosexuality are they talking about? Is it sodomy or is it something else? No. Paul's talking about homosexuality as a whole being a perversion of the intended ways. That's a pretty definitive statement. All right? And so for us to engage in that homosexuality inclusion debate within the church, which is very real, by the way, and it has to be entertained, but it has to be entertained smartly and intelligently, we can't ignore statements like this. We can't ignore statements of Paul in Romans chapter 1. That is an issue that has a direct one-to-one correspondence here and has definitive statements associated with. Now, the other thing, women being quiet, it's a little different. Okay? Because what we know is that Paul is addressing a specific situation, so that one-to-one correspondence isn't there. All right, so then what do we do then? If there's no one-to-one correspondence, that makes the avenue of application fairly, a lot easier, I should say, because application is never easy, but a lot easier. Then what do we do? Well, the first thing we have to do is take a step back. Take a step back and try to figure out, what's the principle driving this? What's Paul really saying? What's driving Paul's statement here? Because it's that principle that will then allow us to find other points of comparison, other points of continuity that will open up the road for application and applying that text to our lives.